In the frozen depths of the Andes, where hope had all but vanished, the struggle was not only against the merciless cold, but against their own conscience. Trapped in a world of ice and despair, a harrowing choice emerged. To survive, some had to consume the remains of their fallen friends. How does one endure such an unimaginable decision? And how did they live to tell their
In the crisp winter of 1972, the Uruguayan rugby team was buzzing with excitement. They were a close-knit group of young athletes, embarking on a journey that promised not only a thrilling rugby match in Chile, but also the chance to explore new land and test their mettle. They boarded a small, weathered Fairchild FH-270 aircraft, bound for a friendly game against a team in Santiago. The plane, although modest, was filled with anticipation and camaraderie. The journey started smoothly, with the players laughing and sharing stories, their spirits high despite the cramped quarters. Outside the windows, the vast expanse of the South American landscape unfolded, a patchwork of greens and browns slowly giving way to the snow-capped peaks of the Andes as they approached their destination. As the plane began its descent, the pilots encountered an unexpected storm, a tempest of swirling snow and fierce winds that buffeted the aircraft. The turbulence grew violent, rattling the plane as if it were a mere toy in nature's hands. The players' laughter and chatter faded into nervous silence, replaced by anxious glances and gripping seatbelts. The plane struggled to navigate through the blizzard, the pilots fighting to maintain control. Visibility dropped to nearly zero, and the storm's howling winds drowned out all but the most urgent of communications. The aircraft, once a symbol of their excitement and hope, now became a vessel of impending doom. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently, a deep shudder reverberating through its frame. The passengers braced themselves, their faces etched with fear as the realization sank in. They were in grave danger. The pilots, despite their best efforts, were unable to overcome the storm's ferocity. The plane's descent became a chaotic plunge, and in a heart-stopping moment, it crashed into the rugged, icy terrain of the Andes Mountains. The impact was catastrophic. The one-sprout aircraft was now twisted wreck, scattered across the snow-covered mountainside. Amid the wreckage and the silent cold of the high-altitude wasteland, the survivors of the crash were left to confront the harsh reality of their situation. Many had perished in the initial impact, their dreams and hopes extinguished in an instant. The living were left with nothing but the chilling wind, the stark white landscape, and a growing sense of despair. The survivors, 27 in total, were forced to grapple with the enormity of their predicament. Stranded in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, they faced an immediate challenge: to survive against all odds in a place where nature itself seemed intent on their destruction. Their excitement had transformed into a desperate struggle for life, setting the stage for a story of courage, survival, and unimaginable choices. The immediate aftermath of the crash was a scene of chaos and confusion. The once pristine snow was now stained with the wreckage of the Fairchild FH-270, its metallic debris scattered across the mountainside like a jigsaw puzzle of twisted metal and broken dreams. The survivors, dazed and disoriented, slowly emerged from the shattered fuselage, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. The bitter cold of the Andean night enveloped them, cutting through their clothing as if it were made of paper. The air was thin and sharp, each breath a struggle against the icy chill. Their initial attempts to assess the damage were met with the harsh reality of their situation. The plane's radio equipment was inoperable, and the severe storm had buried much of the wreckage under a thick layer of snow. The survivors, a mix of players and staff, gathered in small, shivering groups, their breath forming clouds in the frosty air. The sight of their fallen friends, some barely recognizable, was a heavy blow to their spirits. With no sign of immediate rescue and no means of contacting the outside world, their hope dwindled with each passing hour. As the night fell, the temperature plummeted further. The survivors, already weakened by the crash and exposure, faced a new threat: hypothermia. They used scraps of the wreckage to build makeshift shelters, desperately trying to create some semblance of warmth against the biting cold. Their clothing, now tattered and inadequate, did little to protect them from the elements. They huddled together for warmth, trying to keep their spirits up despite the mounting desperation. The survivors' attempts to find food and water proved fruitless. The snow-covered landscape offered little in terms of sustenance, and the plane's supplies were quickly exhausted. Their initial ration of food, chocolate bars, a few cans of food, and some bottles of wine disappeared rapidly, leaving them with nothing but hunger and the relentless cold. The following days brought no relief. The storm continued its relentless assault, and the wreckage of the plane was gradually buried under the snow. The survivors were isolated, their cries for help swallowed by the vast, unforgiving mountains. Each day brought new challenges, worsening weather, dwindling supplies, and the constant struggle to stay warm. Their hopes for rescue seemed increasingly distant as the days turned into weeks. By the end of the first week, reality had set in with brutal clarity. The search and rescue efforts were underway but hampered by the storm and the difficult terrain. The survivors learned from intermittent radio communications that the search parties had been forced to retreat due to the severe weather, leaving them to face their fate alone. With no immediate hope of rescue and their physical conditions deteriorating, the survivors were forced to confront an unimaginable choice. As their hunger grew and their strength waned, they were left with a dire decision. The need to survive outweighed all other considerations. The lines between life and death blurred as they faced the agonizing reality of their situation. Thus, the disaster that had begun with a sudden, violent crash evolved into a grueling test of survival, pushing the survivors to the limits of human endurance and morality. The unforgiving mountains had become both their prison and their battleground, and the true struggle for survival was only beginning. As the sun rose over the jagged peaks of the Andes, its weak light struggled to pierce through the heavy clouds and swirling snow. For the survivors of the plane crash, the new day brought little relief from the relentless hardship of the previous days. The landscape was a barren, wide wasteland, the remnants of their aircraft now half buried beneath a thick layer of snow. The survivors, huddled in their makeshift shelters, faced a brutal reality that was far removed from the warmth and camaraderie they had once known. The initial shock of the crash had given way to a stark awareness of their dire situation. The survivors, many of whom had sustained injuries in the crash, were now battling the unforgiving cold and hunger. Their clothing, inadequate for the extreme temperatures, was tattered and stained, barely offering any protection against the biting wind. The makeshift shelters they had constructed from the wreckage provided minimal cover, their flimsy construction barely keeping out the cold. Food and water were scarce. The plane's supplies, a meager collection of chocolate bars, canned goods, and a few bottles of wine, had been quickly consumed. In their desperation, they searched through the wreckage for anything that could be of use, but the storm had scattered most of their possessions. What remained was buried under the snow, and their attempts to dig through it were hampered by the cold and exhaustion. Their attempts to maintain a semblance of normalcy were in vain. The survivors tried to organize themselves, taking turns to venture out into the snow in search of any possible supplies or signs of rescue. Each foray into the harsh environment was met with the same result, a bleak and changing landscape of snow and ice. They could see nothing beyond the immediate wreckage, and the howling wind obscured any distant sounds of potential help. As the days dragged on, their physical and mental conditions began to deteriorate. The cold seeped into their bones, making every movement a painful effort. The thin air at high altitude left them breathless and weak. Exhaustion mounted as their bodies struggled to cope with the lack of food and the extreme cold. Morale plummeted as hope for a quick rescue faded. The emotional toll was equally severe. The weight of their predicament bore down on them, and the reality of their situation became a constant, heavy burden. Conversations turned from hopeful plans to grim discussions about survival and the possibility of never being rescued. The death of their friends, a harsh reminder of their own vulnerability, added to their anguish. Nightfall brought an additional layer of suffering. The temperature plummeted further, and the survivors' shelters, barely adequate during the day, were now hopelessly insufficient against the freezing night. The wind howled relentlessly, and the cold was an ever-present force, making sleep nearly impossible. They huddled together, trying to preserve whatever warmth they could, but the cold was relentless. Every day that passed without rescue deepened their desperation. The survivors were forced to confront their most primal instincts. With their strength dwindling and their situation growing more desperate, the idea of eating whatever they could find became a grim reality. The mounting hunger and the harsh conditions tested their resolve and their humanity. The harsh reality of their predicament was a crushing weight, one that turned the survivors' journey from a hopeful adventure into a fight for their very survival. The extreme cold, the constant hunger, and the emotional strain forged a grueling battle that would push them to the limits of human endurance and force them to make choices they never imagined they would face. In the midst of the relentless cold and the daunting vastness of the Andes, the survivors of the plane crash clung to whatever hope they could muster. The harsh reality of their situation was unyielding, but even in the face of such dire circumstances, they made valiant efforts to maintain a sense of optimism and unity. The initial shock of the crash had begun to settle into a grim routine. The survivors, though physically weakened and emotionally drained, tried to find solace in small acts of solidarity. They gathered together in their makeshift shelters, sharing stories and encouraging each other in a bid to stave off despair. The camaraderie that had once been part of their rugby team spirit now became a crucial lifeline. Every morning, as the first light of dawn barely penetrated the dense clouds, the survivors would gather in a small group. They took turns checking the wreckage for any signs of supplies or useful materials. Despite the cold numbing their fingers and the snow making each movement a struggle, they remained hopeful that they might find something that could aid their survival. Each fine, however small, a fragment of food, a bottle of water was greeted with cautious optimism. To distract themselves from the growing hunger and the monotony of their situation, the survivors created routines. They took turns performing tasks like organizing the wreckage, reinforcing their shelters, and keeping watch for any sign of rescuers. This structure gave them a sense of purpose and normalcy amidst the chaos. They set small, daily goals such as maintaining their shelters or conserving what little resources they had, which helped them focus on immediate, manageable tasks rather than the overwhelming enormity of their predicament. At night, when the temperature dropped even further, they gathered around makeshift fires made from plain wreckage and would scavenge from the surrounding area. The fires provided a small measure of warmth and a space for reflection. During these moments, they shared memories of their lives before the crash, talking about their families, their homes, and their dreams. These conversations were bittersweet, but served to remind them of what they had to live for. Their faith in rescue never completely waned. The survivors held on to the hope that search and rescue teams would soon find them. They would scan the skies for any sign of aircraft, and when the weather permitted, they used bright pieces of clothing and reflective materials from the wreckage to create signals visible from the air. Every sound that pierced the howling wind was met with heightened anticipation, a small glimmer of hope that perhaps someone had come to save them. Their physical condition continued to deteriorate, and the lack of food began to take its toll on their strength and spirits. Yet, the survivors' resolve remained surprisingly strong. They created a communal sense of responsibility, motivating each other with the belief that if they worked together and stayed hopeful, their chances of survival and rescue would improve. In these small, shared moments of hope and solidarity, the survivors forged an emotional strength that was as crucial as their physical endurance. Their unity, their determination to support one another, and their refusal to give up hope in the face of overwhelming odds became their greatest assets. Despite the ever-present threat of despair, the survivors' attempts to stay hopeful were a testament to their resilience. They faced each day with a quiet determination, holding on to the belief that their perseverance would eventually lead to rescue. This unyielding hope, even in the most crushing of circumstances, was a beacon that helped guide them through the darkest of times. The days had merged into a ceaseless blur of white and cold. The survivors of the plane crash, now more than a month into their ordeal, faced a crushing reality. The relentless snowfall, the frigid temperatures, and the dwindling supplies had pushed them to the edge of their endurance. The once faint hope of rescue had been replaced by the harsh knowledge that their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Hunger had become their constant companion, gnawing at their insides with an insatiable ferocity. The small amount of food they had initially managed to salvage was long gone. Their bodies, weakened by the cold and starvation, were now shadows of their former selves. Each day, the struggle for survival grew more desperate. The survivors' conversations turned from hopeful plans to grim, pragmatic discussions about their dire circumstances. One particularly brutal day, the survivors huddled together in their makeshift shelters, their faces gaunt and ice hollow with exhaustion. The cold had seeped into their bones, making every movement a painful effort. Despite their attempts to stay warm, the frigid air made their fingers numb and their breath come in short, ragged bursts. The little food they had left was long gone, and the hunger was an ever-present, consuming force. As the cold intensified, so did the sense of dread. The survivors had reached the breaking point where their physical and emotional reserves were utterly depleted. The constant struggle against the elements, coupled with the unrelenting hunger, had begun to erode their mental fortitude. Tensions rose, and the group's unity, once a source of strength, now showed signs of fracturing under the strain. The breaking point came with a somber realization. The survivors had exhausted all conventional means of survival. The thought of using the bodies of their deceased friends and teammates, once an unthinkable notion, now became a stark necessity. The idea had been whispered in hushed, haunted tones, but now it was an inescapable reality. The decision was not made lightly. The survivors gathered for what was perhaps the most harrowing discussion of their lives. The emotional toll of the choice was evident in their faces. There was no sense of triumph or victory, only the heavy weight of survival against a backdrop of unimaginable grief. Each survivor grappled with their own moral compass, the lines between right and wrong blurring in the face of their desperate need to stay alive. A somber agreement was reached. With great reluctance and profound sorrow, the survivors began the harrowing process of using the bodies of those who had perished. The act was carried out with the utmost respect and reverence for the deceased. Their friends, who had once been teammates and companions, were now a source of sustenance in the fight against death. The physical act of consuming the flesh of their fallen comrades was matched by an emotional anguish that was nearly unbearable. Each meal, each bite, was accompanied by an internal struggle, a deep, wrenching conflict between their need to survive and the overwhelming grief and horror of their actions. The breaking point had tested the survivors' limits, pushing them beyond the edge of their endurance and forcing them to confront the darkest aspects of their humanity. Their fight for survival had become a battle not just against the elements but against their own inner turmoil. Despite the profound sorrow and moral conflict, the survivors continued to cling to the hope that somehow, against all odds, rescue would come. In this darkest moment of their ordeal, the survivors' resilience and their will to live were put to the ultimate test. The breaking point had irrevocably changed them, leaving a mark on their souls that would linger long after their rescue. Their story was one of profound sacrifice, unbearable hardship, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. As the brutal winter of the Andes dragged on, the survivors of the plane crash faced a moral dilemma that eclipsed even the physical hardships of their ordeal. They had been trapped in the unforgiving mountains for over a month, their strength sapped by hunger, cold, and exhaustion. The once clear line between right and wrong had become increasingly obscured by the dire circumstances. The survivors had reached a critical point. The scant food they had salvaged was long gone, and their bodies were growing weaker by the day. The frigid temperatures and constant snowfall had taken a heavy toll on their morale. The only sources of sustenance remaining were the bodies of their deceased teammates, who had perished in the crash or from the harsh conditions that followed. What had once been an unthinkable option was now a grim reality they could no longer ignore. In the dim light of their makeshift shelters, the survivors convened a somber meeting. The group was composed of a mix of players, coaches, and support staff, each bearing the visible marks of their struggle. Their faces, gaunt and hollow, reflected the deep inner conflict they were grappling with. The conversation was strained, as each member of the group weighed their options and struggled with the profound ethical implications of their situation. Among the survivors, the debate was heated. Some argued that their primary responsibility was to stay alive, no matter the cost. They spoke of the necessity of survival and the harsh reality that if they did not use the bodies of the deceased, they would likely meet the same fate. They framed their argument in terms of practical need, emphasizing that without this drastic measure, their chances of survival were nil. Others, however, were deeply troubled by the idea. They expressed their horror and revulsion at the thought of consuming the flesh of their friends. The emotional and psychological weight of the decision was immense. These individuals argued that maintaining their moral integrity was just as crucial as their physical survival. To them, the act of cannibalism was not merely a physical necessity, but a violation of fundamental human decency. The discussion became increasingly fraught, with emotions running high. Tears mingled with anger as survivors confronted each other's perspectives. Some spoke of the pain of losing friends and the added agony of using their remains for sustenance. Others highlighted their own growing weakness and the real risk of death if they did not act. Eventually, the group reached a tentative consensus. They agreed to proceed with the grim task, but with profound respect for their fallen comrades. A plan was devised to ensure that the process was carried out with as much dignity as possible. They took turns performing the task, each act accompanied by a solemn ceremony and the recitation of names and stories of those who had died. The ritual was a way to honor their friends and maintain a semblance of humanity amidst the harshest of circumstances. The moral dilemma of cannibalism was a shattering blow to the survivors' sense of self. They were forced to confront the darkest parts of their humanity, making a choice that would haunt them long after their ordeal had ended. Each bite of the flesh was a reminder of the immense price they had paid, and each meal was a testament to their struggle not only against the elements but against their own internal conflicts. The act of survival had become a complex interplay of physical need and ethical considerations. The survivors emerged from their ordeal forever marked by the choices they had made, their story a profound testament to the lengths to which the human spirit can be tested. In the aftermath of their harrowing experience, they would carry the weight of their moral decisions, a somber reminder of the fragility of morality in the face of extreme adversity. The survivors of the plane crash in the Andes had been grappling with the harsh realities of their situation for weeks. The unyielding cold and relentless hunger had already pushed them to the brink of despair. But as they struggled to maintain hope amidst their dire circumstances, nature delivered a devastating blow that would further test their endurance. It began as a faint rumble, a low, ominous sound that reverberated through the mountains. The survivors, accustomed to the howling winds and shifting snow, initially dismissed it as just another unsettling aspect of their environment. But as the noise grew louder and more insistent, a palpable sense of unease began to spread through the group. The rumbling intensified into a deafening roar. The survivors looked up to see dark, rolling clouds gathering above the peaks, casting a shadow over their already bleak world. The wind howled with a fury they had not previously experienced, sending snow swirling in violent gusts. The temperature plummeted further, the cold now bone-chillingly intense. In a matter of minutes, the storm turned into a full-blown blizzard. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet. The survivors, already exhausted and frail, struggled to secure their shelters against the onslaught. The howling wind tore through the mountains, and the temperature dropped precipitously, making the freezing conditions even more unbearable. The survivors, huddled together in their shelters, faced a new crisis as the blizzard continued its relentless assault. The already meager supplies they had managed to gather were buried under the fresh layer of snow. The wreckage that had once offered some shelter and protection was now obscure and scattered. The howling wind made it impossible to venture outside, and any attempts to retrieve supplies or reinforce their shelters were thwarted by the storm's ferocity. As the blizzard raged on, the survivors' plight became increasingly dire. Their shelters, which had previously offered a thin barrier against the elements, now struggled to withstand the force of the storm. The constant wind whipped snow into every crevice, and the temperature continued to drop. The survivors' clothing, already inadequate, did little to shield them from the biting cold. Inside their shelters, the survivors faced a new challenge. The blizzard had rendered their makeshift fires useless, leaving them without any source of warmth. The cold seeped into their bones, and their breath came in visible puffs as they shivered uncontrollably. The hunger that had already plagued them was now compounded by the bitter cold, making every moment a test of endurance. The blizzard continued unabated for days. The survivors, already weakened by hunger and cold, found their physical and mental strength pushed to its limits. The constant noise of the storm, combined with the relentless cold and darkness, created an atmosphere of overwhelming despair. Their attempts to stay hopeful were overshadowed by the immediate struggle for survival. As the blizzard finally began to abate, the survivors emerged from their shelters to find a transformed landscape. The once familiar surroundings were now buried under a thick blanket of snow, with the wreckage of their plane almost completely obscure. The storm had taken a heavy toll on their already dire situation, and the survivors were left to dig through the snow in search of anything that might aid their survival. The natural catastrophe had compounded their suffering, turning an already grim situation into one of almost unbearable hardship. The blizzard was a stark reminder of the unrelenting power of nature and its ability to shape the fate of those caught in its grip. For the survivors, it was a harsh lesson in the fragility of hope and the relentless struggle for survival against the formidable forces of nature. In the unforgiving expanse of the Andes, the survivors of the plane crash had endured unimaginable trials. Their days had been marked by relentless cold, unending hunger, and the crushing weight of their predicament. Yet, amidst the crushing adversity, the true test of their character emerged, the enduring strength of the human spirit. The survivors had been trapped for weeks, their bodies ravaged by starvation and exhaustion. The blizzard that had battered them had finally passed, leaving behind a landscape of snow and ice. The survivors faced the daunting task of digging through the snow to retrieve what little they could from the wreckage. Despite their weakened state, they approached this task with a sense of determination that bordered on defiance. Every movement was a struggle. Their limbs, numb from the cold and weakened by malnutrition, felt heavy and cumbersome. Yet, they pressed on, driven by an indomitable will to survive. They took turns digging through the snow, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they fought against the biting cold. The effort was grueling, but their resolve was unshakable. As they worked, they found small tokens of hope amidst the wreckage flares, bits of clothing, and fragments of supplies. Each discovery, no matter how insignificant it seemed, was a reminder that their struggle was not in vain. These small victories provided a glimmer of hope and a renewed sense of purpose. The survivors also found solace in their camaraderie. The shared hardships forged a deep bond among them, a connection that became a source of strength. They took turns sharing stories of their lives before the crash, reminiscing about happier times and drawing comfort from their shared humanity. These moments of connection helped to sustain their spirits, providing a vital emotional lifeline. In the face of their suffering, they demonstrated remarkable resilience. They maintained a routine, even in the absence of food and proper shelter. Each day, they performed necessary tasks with a methodical precision, from maintaining their shelters to rationing the scant resources they had. Their ability to impose structure on their chaotic environment was a testament to their mental fortitude. The survivors also showed incredible endurance in their efforts to signal for rescue. They used whatever materials they could find to create makeshift signaling devices. They fashioned bright-colored flags from scraps of clothing and constructed large, visible markers in the snow. Despite their dwindling strength, they persevered in their efforts, driven by the hope that someone, somewhere, might see their signals and come to their aid. The days turned into weeks, and the survivors' physical condition continued to deteriorate, yet their spirits remained unbroken. The constant struggle against the elements, the gnawing hunger, and the emotional toll of their situation were met with a resilience that defied the odds. Their ability to adapt, to find moments of hope, and to support one another was a profound demonstration of human strength. Their perseverance paid off when, after a harrowing 72 days, a rescue team finally spotted their signals. The sight of the rescuers was a moment of pure relief and elation. The survivors, exhausted but triumphant, were finally freed from their ordeal. Their journey had been one of unparalleled hardship, but their endurance and resilience had seen them through. The story of their survival was not just one of physical endurance, but also of the unyielding strength of the human spirit. Their ability to face the direst of circumstances with courage and solidarity was a testament to their extraordinary resilience. Their tale would serve as a powerful reminder of the capacity for hope and perseverance, even in the darkest of times. As the days turned into weeks, the survivors of the plane crash in the Andes faced an unrelenting struggle for survival. The snow had buried their plane, and their chances of rescue seemed increasingly remote. Each day, their strength waned, and the cold gnawed at their resolve. Yet, amid the mounting despair, a glimmer of hope emerged. One final attempt to escape their dire situation. The idea had come from Roberto, a former rugby player whose leadership and unwavering determination had been a source of strength for the group. He had been poring over the scan maps and survival manuals he'd managed to salvage, piecing together a plan that seemed both daring and necessary. Despite their deteriorating condition, Roberto believed that if they could reach a higher elevation, they might be able to signal for help or even find a way out of the mountains. The plan was fraught with risks, the terrain was treacherous, and the weather conditions remained harsh. The survivors had already endured so much, and the thought of embarking on such a perilous journey was daunting. But with their supplies dwindling and the cold seeping deeper into their bones, they knew they had little choice but to try. The group gathered for a final meeting to discuss the plan. Their faces, etched with exhaustion and hope, reflected the gravity of the decision. Each person knew the journey would be grueling, and the chances of success were uncertain. Still, the prospect of remaining trapped in the mountains with their strength fading was a grim fate they were unwilling to accept. With a somber resolve, the survivors prepared for the journey. They gathered what little gear they had: makeshift snowshoes fashioned from scraps, the remnants of their clothing, and a few meager supplies. The preparations were carried out with meticulous care, every detail considered in hopes of maximizing their chances of success. As they set out, the blizzard that had once been their relentless adversary had momentarily subsided, leaving behind a landscape of sparkling snow under a pale, wintry sun. The survivors trudged through the deep snow, their breath forming visible puffs in the icy air. Each step was an effort, and the cold seemed to cling to them like an unwelcome shroud. The journey was arduous, the snow was deep and unyielding, and the survivors' progress was slow. The wind picked up again, biting at their exposed skin and making each step feel like a battle. Despite their fatigue, they pressed on, driven by the hope that their efforts might lead to salvation. The snow was deep and unyielding, and the survivors' progress was slow. The wind picked up again, biting at their exposed skin and making each step feel like a battle. Despite their fatigue, they pressed on, driven by the hope that their efforts might lead to salvation. As they climbed higher, the terrain became increasingly rugged. Steep slopes and icy crevasses posed new challenges, testing their resolve and their physical limits. They took turns leading the group, forging a path through the snow and helping each other navigate the treacherous landscape. Their unity and determination were their greatest assets, allowing them to overcome the obstacles that lay before them. After several grueling days, the survivors reached a high ridge, their hopes buoyed by the sight of a distant search plane gliding across the sky. Exhausted and on the brink of collapse, they used every remaining ounce of energy to create large, visible signals, brightly colored fabric from their clothing arranged in patterns that would be easily spotted from above. The moment was both exhilarating and harrowing. They watched the sky with bated breath, their eyes straining to catch a glimpse of the plane as it maneuvered closer. Each passing hour was a test of patience and resilience, the cold seeping deeper as they huddled together for warmth. Their efforts finally bore fruit when the search plane circled back, its crew having spotted the signals. The survivors erupted in a mixture of tears and cheers, their relief palpable as they realized their final attempt had succeeded. A rescue team was dispatched, and the survivors were eventually airlifted to safety. The ordeal was over, but the journey had left an indelible mark on them. The final attempt to escape the mountains was a testament to their enduring spirit and their refusal to surrender. Their story of survival was one of courage and determination, a powerful reminder of the lengths to which the human spirit can go when faced with the most formidable challenges. The survivors had reached a critical juncture in their ordeal. After weeks of grueling struggle and facing the relentless harshness of the Andes, their spirits were on the brink of collapse. The final attempt to escape had been their last hope, and the exhaustion in their eyes reflected the sheer weight of their harrowing journey. Yet, amid their fading hope, a beacon of salvation appeared on the horizon. As the survivors huddled together on the high ridge they had painstakingly reached, they remained vigilantly focused on the distant search plane that had finally emerged from the cloudy sky. The sight of the plane was a mixed blessing, its presence a symbol of hope, but also a reminder of the precariousness of their situation. They knew that their chances of rescue hinged on their ability to signal effectively and endure the final stretch of their ordeal. The survivors worked with desperate urgency, their frail bodies moving with a newfound determination. They arranged bright strips of fabric, scavenged from their remaining supplies, into large, eye-catching patterns on the snow. Every motion was measured, every placement of fabric carefully considered to maximize visibility. They knew that this was their best chance for rescue, and they poured all their remaining strength into making their signals as prominent as possible. Hours passed with agonizing slowness as the survivors watched the sky, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The cold was unrelenting, and the wind carried a bone-chilling bite. Despite their numbing fatigue, they remained alert, their hopes rising with every passing minute. Then, as if in response to their unwavering perseverance, the search plane made a decisive maneuver. The aircraft descended lower, its engines growling louder as it began a sweeping search pattern. The survivors' hearts raced with a mixture of hope and anxiety. They frantically waved their makeshift signal flags, their arms growing heavy, but their spirits buoyed by the sight of the approaching plane. The plane circled overhead, its crew members peering out with trained eyes. The survivors, desperate to be seen, made frantic gestures, their voices hoarse, but their resolve strong. It was a moment of excruciating tension as they awaited confirmation of their visibility. Finally, the plane veered closer and began its descent toward the ridge. The survivors erupted into tears of relief and joy, their weary bodies trembling with a mix of elation and exhaustion. As the plane touched down on a nearby open area, the sound of its engines cut through the silence like a lifeline. Rescue personnel swiftly disembarked from the aircraft, their faces filled with a mix of concern and determination. They moved with practiced efficiency, assessing the survivors' condition and providing immediate assistance. Blankets, food, and medical supplies were distributed, and the survivors were gently but swiftly guided onto stretchers. The emotional reunion with their rescuers was a poignant moment of triumph. The survivors, whose faces had once been marked by desperation and despair, now bore expressions of profound relief. They were enveloped in warmth and care, their ordeal coming to a close as they were whisked away from the harsh embrace of the mountains. As the survivors were airlifted to safety, they looked back one last time at the stark, snowy landscape that had been both their prison and their battleground. Their journey had been one of unimaginable hardship, but their resolve and the final attempt had led to their rescue. They were greeted with the compassion and care they so desperately needed, their story of endurance and resilience becoming a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit. The survivors would carry the scars of their experience with them, but they would also carry a profound sense of gratitude and a renewed appreciation for life. Their rescue was a beacon of hope in the darkest of times, a reminder of the unwavering power of hope and the incredible lengths to which people can go to save each other. As the helicopter lifted off from the snowy ridge, the survivors of the Andes plane crash were engulfed in a cocoon of warmth and comfort for the first time in months. The cold, harsh reality of their ordeal had begun to recede, replaced by the soothing hum of the helicopter's engines and the sight of the distant mountain peaks gradually fading into the background. Inside the helicopter, the atmosphere was one of profound relief. The survivors, wrapped in blankets and receiving urgent medical attention, could scarcely believe that their harrowing journey was coming to an end. The exhaustion etched into their faces was palpable, but it was softened by the glimmers of hope and gratitude in their eyes. The crew members worked with practiced efficiency, administering first aid and providing the survivors with much-needed nourishment. They offered warm drinks, small bites of food, and blankets to stave off the lingering chill that had settled into their bones. For the survivors, the simple comforts were nothing short of miraculous, a stark contrast to the brutal conditions they had endured. As the helicopter flew toward the nearest medical facility, the survivors exchanged silent, knowing glances. Words seemed insufficient to convey the overwhelming emotions they were feeling. The agony of the past weeks, the fear and uncertainty, all began to dissolve into a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. The helicopter's interior, once a small, cramped space filled with anxious faces, now felt like a sanctuary of safety and solace. Outside, the landscape of the Andes gradually transformed as the helicopter descended toward civilization. The rugged snow-covered mountains gave way to verdant valleys and bustling towns. The survivors gazed out at the changing scenery with a mix of awe and disbelief, the realization that they were leaving the mountains behind sinking in with every passing moment. When the helicopter finally landed at the medical facility, the survivors were met with a scene of organized chaos. Medical personnel and emergency responders rushed to greet them, their faces a blend of concern and relief. The survivors were carefully transferred from the helicopter to awaiting ambulances, where they were whisked away for a thorough medical evaluation and treatment. As they arrived at the facility, they were greeted by family members and friends who had been anxiously waiting for news. The emotional reunions were charged with raw, heartfelt expressions of relief and joy. Tears flowed freely as loved ones embraced the survivors, their faces reflecting a mixture of gratitude, sorrow, and overwhelming happiness. The medical staff worked diligently to tend to the survivors, addressing their physical and emotional needs with compassionate care. For many of the survivors, this was the first time they had felt true comfort since the crash. The warmth of the hospital, the soothing touch of caregivers, and the gentle reassurance of loved ones all contributed to a profound sense of relief. The days following their rescue were filled with recovery and reflection. The survivors began to process the magnitude of their experience, their bodies gradually regaining strength and their spirits slowly healing from the trauma. They were surrounded by support both from medical professionals and from a network of friends and family who provided unwavering encouragement and comfort. Their story of survival and rescue became a powerful testament to human resilience and hope. As they began to heal, the survivors found solace in sharing their experiences, offering insight into their incredible journey and the strength they had drawn from each other. Their tale was a reminder of the fragility of life and the profound capacity for endurance and recovery. In the end, the relief they felt was not just a physical release from the ordeal, but also an emotional liberation. Their rescue marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where the shadows of their past were illuminated by the enduring light of hope and human connection. The experience had changed them forever, but it also revealed the boundless depth of their courage and the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to overcome even the greatest of challenges. As the years passed, the story of the Andes plane crash survivors became a profound narrative woven into the fabric of human endurance and courage. The harrowing events of 1972, marked by unimaginable hardship and an unyielding will to survive, evolved into a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The survivors, once trapped in the icy embrace of the Andes, emerged not just as victims of a tragedy, but as symbols of hope and strength. Their journey from the desolate mountains to a place of recovery and healing was more than a story of survival. It was a reflection of their unbreakable spirit and their determination to make something meaningful from their suffering. Their experiences, shared through media, advocacy, and personal stories, touched hearts and inspired countless individuals. Their legacy, built on the principles of resilience, hope, and compassion, became a guiding light for others facing adversity. By using their platform to educate, advocate, and support, the survivors turned their ordeal into a force for positive change, impacting lives and improving safety protocols for future generations. The survivors' lives continued to unfold in new and meaningful ways. They found solace in their roles as educators, advocates, and contributors to a greater cause. Their personal and collective efforts to assist others and raise awareness about survival and trauma recovery became integral to their identities. Their story was not just a tale of the past but a living legacy, continuously influencing and inspiring. In their quiet moments of reflection, the survivors often revisited the lessons learned from their ordeal. They remembered the bonds forged in the crucible of adversity, the acts of bravery and sacrifice that defined their struggle, and the unwavering hope that had guided them through the darkest hours. Their journey, marked by both profound suffering and extraordinary triumph, left an indelible mark on their lives and the lives of those who came to know their story. The conclusion of their narrative was not an end but a continuation of their legacy, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Their story served as a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, there is strength in unity, hope in despair, and a profound capacity for survival and renewal. As the survivors looked back on their incredible journey, they saw it not just as a series of tragic events, but as a journey that had shaped their understanding of life and humanity. Their legacy was a beacon of hope, a powerful affirmation of the human capacity to overcome the greatest of challenges and to emerge stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. In the end, the story of the Andes plane crash survivors was a celebration of the human spirit's resilience, a reminder that even in the most trying circumstances, there is always a glimmer of hope and the possibility of a brighter future. Their lives and their legacy continued to inspire and uplift, a living testament to the enduring strength and hope that define the essence of being human.